Thank you all for coming out here. It's great to see such a big crowd of people. I'm really excited. When Chris first pitched this idea to me, this question of what does it mean to be an American, I was curious about what do people say if you ask them that question. I don't know. And there was that Pew Research survey, Pew Research Center survey that's actually in the description on that question, what does it mean to be an American? It was covered on NPR and elsewhere. But that was really a close-ended question, and a lot of the countries came up with a similar list of, I think being Christian was on one of the top reasons, or top explanations, speaking the English language, celebrating the shared cultural traditions. But this was common from a number of countries, and again, it was close-ended. They gave them a list and you were supposed to rank them. So I wanted to know, what if you ask people this open-ended question, what does it mean to be an American? What comes up? So I didn't engage in a really scholarly investigation of it. I just Googled the phrase, and one of the top result that will come up if you Google what does it mean to be an American is a site from scholastic.com. It's a bunch of school-aged kids who they've asked to write down what do they think it means. And this first response is prominently featured on their website. To be an American, to me, means that I am free. That when I grow up, I can pick the job I want, what shift to work, and to have a good education. It means that I can say the Pledge of Allegiance and that I can vote for the president, my county clerk, and the mayor. But to me, it means most of all to be free and to be proud that I live in the United States of America. And this idea to be free is riddled throughout all of the comments, most of the comments that are up there, and also to say the pledge. A lot of these kids are saying to be an American means that I get to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So I thought, given my own experiences in school and my two daughters who are here tonight, Justice in the front and Hope in the back, the little one who's kind of shy, so don't look at her, but given their experiences, and Hope's in elementary school and it's really strong there. They have a principal who on Veterans Day, you're basically required to go out on the blacktop and stand and listen to all these patriotic songs and salute the flag and say the pledge. And so I wonder what happens to the kids who refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, that's something Justice would do. Like, what happens to that? Is being an American, is it equally valid to dissent? Is that being an American? Is being an American having the right to not say the pledge? And you're supposed to have that right in public school. Freedom of expression is protected in public schools. But what happens to the kids who do that, right? They're usually, maybe some of you all try that. You're usually chastised in maybe subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle ways. And like the thing with Veterans Day, I raised this with their principal. It's not, I get why she's doing it. My dad was a veteran. I come from a working class community where most people's fathers were veterans, and it was kind of a norm there. But what they're not getting is they don't hear from veterans who are in organizations like About Face or Iraq Veterans Against the War. They're not getting multiple perspectives. They're getting a very one-sided conformist perspective. And so you see it riddled throughout these comments. So here are a couple of others. This is a 10-year-old from Wisconsin. It means that you are free. It also means that you can vote for who you want to. I think it's cool being an American because we are free. The pledge stands for everything. I think it means to be free. I wouldn't want to be from any other country. It's great to be an American. We get to play sports and eat lots of food. We get lots of toys, all because we are free. The best thing of all. Being an American means to be free. It also means to be fair. Being an American is about being free and loyal. It's about having freedom of religion, rights, and justice. It's also about being about yourself. Being an American means that we are all treated equally, no matter what color of skin you have, and it doesn't matter what culture you're from. If you're an American, you are mighty lucky because you will be free forever. Being an American to me means many things, like being able to speak your mind, attend the church you want to attend, celebrate the holidays you want to celebrate, and be a slave to no one. September 11th has proved that all the above are true in America, and we should all be very thankful to be Americans. Peace. That's an 11-year-old from Oregon. And then there's one that goes into a lot more detail. This is a 12-year-old from Hawaii. Being an American, to be an American, many take this phrase too lightly, others too strict. Being an American does not mean that you get to go to baseball games and eat hot dogs, but to live your life to the fullest, not just waving around a flag every day. Being an American is to help another, whether it be Polish or Chinese or Afghan or Muslim. Being an American means helping your sworn enemy, even if you do not wish, but you shall help with dignity and pride. It means that you capture the true essence of every being, from the simplest little flower to the most beautiful person in the world. Being American means to be united as one under whatever deity you worship and to be able to depend, rely, and give hope to each other. Because being an American does not just mean living in America. Every person has a part of being an American in them, deep inside, embedded until they wish to release that piece and share it with the world. That is what a true American is. I mean, there's some nicer things in this one, more openness, inclusiveness. But and we might say, this is scholastic. This is a bunch of school-age kids. What do you expect, right? You wouldn't expect a lot of variation, but that's the point, that they're being indoctrinated into one perspective, and they often don't hear a counter history, like people's history. Some of my students have told me that they were in AP classes in New York City, and their teachers refused to teach Howard Zinn's People's History, and there's actually a movement to ban Howard Zinn's People's History, which is a history written from the perspective of indigenous people. Like how would they interpret the way that these wars played out? But that was seen as bias. That was the reason. Okay, so it's bias to ban Howard Zinn and a history that teaches the reality of racism. Or sorry, it's bias to include it, but it's not bias to ban it. It's not bias to leave that perspective out. This was something that Arizona dealt with recently. In 2010, there was a legal ban on ethnic studies courses in Arizona, and it was a 7-year fight. Only recently did Arizona overturn this so that now they can teach ethnic studies. It was actually banned to the point where administrators were coming into classes and confiscating books. Right? Ethnic studies, why did they ban this? Because it promoted ethnic solidarity and resentment. What these quotes from Scholastic represent is what Neubeck and Glassberg call a tooth fairy approach to education. And I see this as part of a hidden curriculum. Hidden in that the idea that we learn through what we don't learn. We learn through omission, through what we hide in our curriculum, and power over who controls the curriculum, right? Public schools teach slogans and rhetoric instead of encouraging substantive inquiry. Too often children in classrooms not only are sheltered from controversial issues and from the often seamy underside of political life, but even worse, are likely to be rendered politically ignorant. This then cripples their ability to function in the political system as adults, because they are led to confuse the political system as it should be with the political system as it is. Young people are likely to be bewildered and disillusioned when they run into political facts at variance with what they were taught. And I see this all the time in my intro classes at Baruch. And even in some of my upper level courses where students are like, why, when I teach them about the history of the race concept and racism and the different types of racism, why haven't I learned about this? I've heard from students, I've been here for 4 years at Baruch, and they're angry, right? They're very emotional about this. Why hasn't anyone ever told me this? Why has this been kept from my knowledge? Like, what textbooks are we using? In contrast to those tooth fairy approach, this is from Desmond and Amir Bayer's work, Racial Domination, Racial Progress. It's a 2-line poem written by a high school student in one of New York City's poorest high schools. America the beautiful, who are you beautiful for? Now, the point of my talk tonight isn't to engage in a scholarly examination of what different people say, different perspectives on what it means to be an American in terms of what people express, but more about looking at these themes of conformity and silence, and particularly with regard to Asian Americans and the tangled relationship between whiteness and American citizenship. So let's start with 1790, when Congress restricted citizenship only to white people, and this lasted until 1952. So the courts had to decide who is going to be white based on how white they were, or who's going to be a citizen based on whether or not they could prove they were white. And people of color had to go to courts and prove their worthiness as an American citizen through how white they are, right? They had to really work for it. And I want to cover 2 important cases, 2 Supreme Court cases, the case of Takawa Ozawa and Bhagat Singh Thind. During this time, the courts were fluctuating between common sense definitions of whiteness and scientific definitions of whiteness, and sort of going back and forth, and it all came to a head with these 2 cases. So Takawa Ozawa was born in Japan in 1875. He came to the United States in 1894. He went to UC Berkeley. He became a businessman in Hawaii. He applies for citizenship twice, once in 1914, once in 1916. He's denied twice. His court case reaches the Supreme Court in 1922, and he's appealing to both scientific and common sense beliefs. So this is part of what he says in his argument. My honesty and industriousness are well known among my Japanese and American friends. In name, Benedict Arnold was a traitor. was an American, but at heart he was a traitor. In name, I am not an American, but at heart I'm a true American. If you've ever seen the documentary Race, the Power of an Illusion, you've seen this part of his argument before. But listen to what else he says, which is not covered in that documentary. I do not have any connection with any Japanese churches or schools or any Japanese organizations here or elsewhere. I'm sending my children to American church and American school in place of a Japanese one. Most of the time I use the American English language at home so that my children cannot speak the Japanese language. I educated myself in American schools for nearly 11 years by supporting myself. I've continuously lived in the United States for over 28 years. I chose as my wife one educated in American schools instead of one educated in Japan. So to be an American, he has to cut himself completely off from everything that has to do with Japan. His children cannot speak the language. He doesn't want them to, even in the wife that he chooses. So he's really working for it, working for whiteness. He even says something about the color of his skin. In the typical Japanese city of Kyoto, those not exposed to the heat of summer are particularly white-skinned. They are whiter than the average Italian, Spaniard, or Portuguese. So as long as we Japanese stay out of the sun, and our skin doesn't get too dark, then we can be white. If we do that, we have a whiter skin color, and therefore, this is my argument, part of my argument for being white. And this might sound superficial, but I'll tell you, I grew up with a mother who told me to stay out of the sun, and she wasn't concerned about UV rays, and when I was a little girl, I knew she wasn't concerned about the sun's effect on my health. She was concerned because I get very dark in the summer if I'm in the sun too much, and a lot of folks of color still hear that from their parents, stay out of the sun. In fact, Marita Golden wrote a book called Don't Play in the Sun, which gets at other issues of colorism, pigmentocracy, color caste hierarchies among people of color, which a topic for another Olio, colorism. Reflecting on her father's case, Azawa's daughter said, I didn't have any Oriental friends, right? Just the way we were brought up. My neighbors were all Caucasian. So growing up, she's understanding that surrounding herself, surrounding her family with white people, with Caucasians, is very important to acceptance. This is what the court rules after all this in Azawa. The words white person are synonymous with the words a person of the Caucasian race. The appellant in the case now under consideration, however, is clearly of a race which is not Caucasian. A large number of the federal and state courts have so decided, and we find no reported case definitely to the contrary. These decisions are sustained by numerous scientific authorities, which we do not deem it necessary to review. We think these decisions are right and so hold. So in other words, you can't be white unless you prove you are Caucasian scientifically. You have not done that. Caucasian and white are synonymous. You're not a citizen. And this doesn't just affect Ozawa. It affects all Japanese people living in the US. They now cannot be citizens. It's then followed by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. In this court case, really sets up the ideological and political environment that later justifies the internment of Japanese people in the US. Now it gets really interesting with Bhagat Singh Thind. His court case reaches the Supreme Court in only 3 months after Azawa. So Thind was born in a Sikh community in the Punjab region of India, October 1892. He left India in 1912, hoping to become a spiritual teacher, which he does eventually become one in the US. Like Azawa, he attends UC Berkeley. He arrives in the US on the 4th of July in 1913. He's recruited into the Army in July 1918. He fights in World War I. He achieves the rank of acting sergeant. His citizenship was revoked a couple of times. First, he applies in Washington in 1918, and he's approved. His citizenship, he's approved. But the examiner at the Bureau of Naturalization revokes it less than a week later. It's like 4 days later. Then he applies again in Oregon in 1920. But again, that same examiner at the Bureau of Naturalization appeals it. The case goes to the Supreme Court with this question. Is a high caste Hindu of full Indian blood, born in Amritsar, Punjab, India, a white person? He has a strong case. Anthropologists do classify Asian Indians as Caucasian. And what did they just rule? Right, his court case is there 3 months later. They just said if you can prove you're Caucasian, you can be white. However, Justice Sutherland, the same person who delivered the ruling in Azawa, states, the conclusion that the phrase white persons and the word Caucasian are synonymous does not end the matter. It enabled us to dispose of the problem as it was there presented. but the decision still left the question to be dealt with in doubtful and different cases. In other words, we just said that to get us off our backs. We just wanted to get rid of him, right? Like but in this case, it's not the final word in whiteness. And Haney Lopez argues at this point, what science is showing is that whiteness is very arbitrary and open to people that, if you're using the term Caucasian, it's open to people that you wouldn't think. In fact, they state also that Caucasian includes not only the Hindu, but some of the Polynesians and the Hamites of Africa. We venture to think that the average well-informed white American would learn with some degree of astonishment that the race to which he belongs is made up of such heterogeneous elements. So science is not going to serve our purposes here. And they could have said, look, this race thing, it's not natural at all. It's not clear-cut at all. Let's get rid of it. But they didn't. Instead, they turned to common knowledge because science is not giving what they want. So now it's basically common sense says you're not white. So they roll, it is a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characteristics of the Hindus render them readily distinguishable from the various groups of persons commonly recognized as white. So the courts give the impression that they're really struggling with this idea of what whiteness is, and they're being really intellectual about it, when really they're just doing whatever they want. Science doesn't serve their purposes. Now whiteness is whatever the common white man says it is, whatever common sense says, common knowledge. As a result of the ruling in Thin, the federal government begins a campaign to denaturalize Asian Indians. See some parallels with some of the things that Trump has called for today. At least one person commits suicide as a result. And his name was Vashno Das Begai. And I think because the situation for him was so anomic, if you read his suicide letter, he talks about how I've done everything I'm supposed to do. I've worked very hard. I'm honest. I've never committed any crimes. This is what I thought that I had to do to be accepted as an American. And they can just come and strip it away just like that. And so he kills himself. Thind eventually does receive citizenship in 1935 as a result of the Nye Lee Act, which granted citizenship to anyone who fought in World War I, regardless of ethnicity, so it takes that language away. He does give lectures on spirituality, he gets his PhD in theology, and he self-publishes a lot of his books on spirituality. And his son published some of his books. In fact, I recently learned that there's a group of people doing a documentary on Thind. It's called All's Quiet on the Home Front, so we'll look for that. I think this history of conforming to whiteness and working hard, again, to prove your loyalty to this country and your worth as an American citizen by proving that you're white, by proving how white you are, has haunted Asian Americans until today. And I want to examine this theme of conformity and silence in another historical moment where silence was part of survival, and that was Japanese internment. So I have a little background here, just a quick background on what was going on with Japanese internment. Again, I think without the ruling in Ozawa, we wouldn't have been able to do this as effectively. It wouldn't have been supported. It really gave that ideology of Asian Americans as foreigners, as people you could not trust. It really set that ideology up. And what I wanted to do was share this story of the background on internment through a reading by Sandra Oh. As some of you are probably familiar with Sandra Oh. She's an actress who's known for her role in Grey's Anatomy. So she's going to read from Yuri Kochiyama's biography. And with this, you see some of the history of what's going on with internment, and for Yuri, how she goes from a conformist who is really pro-America to someone who becomes a rebel because of her experiments in those internment camps.
Kochiyama, who was born in San Pedro, California, was a member of a family that was among the 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast who were rounded up in a wave of anti-Japanese hysteria that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Here she recalls her experiences in the detention camps.
I was red, white, and blue when I was growing up. I taught Sunday school and was very, very American, but I was also very provincial. We were just kids rooting for our high school. I was 19 at the time of the evacuation. I had just finished junior college. I was looking for a job and didn't realize how different the school world was from the work world. In the school world, I never felt racism. But when you got into the work world, it was very difficult. This was 1941, just before the war. I finally did get a job at a department store. For us back then, it was a big thing because I don't think they had ever hired an Asian in a department store before. I tried because I saw a Mexican friend who got a job there. Everything changed for me on the day Pearl Harbor was bombed. On that very day, December 7th, the FBI came and took my father. He had just come home from the hospital the day before. For several days, we didn't know where they had taken him. Then we had found out that he was taken to the federal prison at Terminal Island. Overnight, things changed for us. Most Japanese Americans had to give up their jobs, whatever they did, and were told they had to leave. The edict for 9066, President Roosevelt's edict for evacuation, was in February 1942. We were moved to a detention center that April. We were sent to an assembly center in Arcadia, California, in April. It was the largest assembly center in the West Coast, having nearly 20,000 people. There were some smaller centers with about 600 people along the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California. There were many, many assembly centers, but ours was the largest. Most of the assembly centers were either fairgrounds or racetracks, so many of us lived in stables. They said we could take only what we could carry. I was so red, white, and blue. I couldn't believe this was happening to us. America would never do a thing like this to us. This was the greatest country in the world. So I thought, this is only going to be for a short while, maybe a few weeks or something, and they'll let us go back. At the beginning, no one realized how long this would go on. I didn't feel anger that much because I thought maybe this was the way we could show our love for our country. And we should not make too much fuss or noise. We should abide by what they asked of us. I'm a totally different person now than I was back then. I was naive about so many things. And the more I think about it, the more I realize how little you learn about American history. It's just what they want you to know. We always called the camps relocation centers while we were there. Now we feel it is apropos to call them concentration camps. It is not the same as the concentration camps of Europe. We feel they were death camps. Concentration camps were a concentration of people placed in an area and disempowered and disenfranchised. So it is apropos to call what I was in a concentration camp. Historically, Americans have always been putting people behind walls. First, there were the American Indians who were put on reservations, Africans in slavery on their lives on plantations, Chicanos doing migratory work in the kind of camps they lived in, and even to the Chinese when they worked on the railroad camps, where they were almost isolated, dispossessed people, disempowered. And I feel those are the things we should fight against so they won't happen again. This whole period of what the Japanese went through is important. If we can see the connections of how often this happens in history, we can stem the tide of these things happening again by speaking out against them.
And Howard Zinn was there, too, doing a reading. So it's interesting, people were also kidnapped from Latin American countries like Peru and put into internment camps because of this concern about hemispheric security. So there were people, it wasn't just people from the US, they actually went to Peru, kidnapped people of Japanese descent, put them in internment camps. This is Yuri Kochiyama. And a lot of people don't know about Yuri Kochiyama. She was a civil rights activist. She was also a Black Panther, a close friend of Malcolm X, so close that his children called her auntie until the day she died. She was 93. She died in the summer of 2014. If you see pictures of Malcolm X when he was shot, she's the woman cradling his head as he's dying. So they had a very close friendship. Her life is documented in Diane Fujino's Heartbeat of Struggle, and one of the points she makes is that one of the reasons we don't know about her is we don't know a lot about Asian American activists, period, because of what she's talking about here, this idea that they're just silent, that they don't complain. And she expresses, Yuri Kochiyama in her biography expresses very well that pressure to keep silent, that let's just do this, let's go to these camps, keep our heads down, be mistreated, and maybe then we'll be accepted as American citizens. But when they came back to their homes, remember, they're stripped of citizenship. They lost the deeds to their home. They lost their property. All the while, they're contributing to the U.S. economy by working on farms, right? So they would come back. Sometimes their house wasn't there. It was demolished. A lot of their stuff was stolen. Somebody else was living there. And 2/3 of the people in those camps were children. Here's a quote, so somehow these children born in the US, the fear is that they have some kind of loyalty, they're a threat. They have some kind of loyalty to the emperor in Japan. This is a quote, "I remember the soldiers marching us to the army tank, and I looked at their rifles, and I was just terrified because I could see this long knife at the end. I thought I was imagining it as an adult much later. I thought it couldn't have been bayonets because we were just little kids. Those who are interned as children are much more likely to suffer from PTSD. Right? And there are other physical costs and financial costs from internment." I've seen some of this silence in documentaries on Japanese internment. It took a long time for this story to be told because those who were interned felt that pressure to be silent. If you're familiar with the novel No-No Boys, so those who answered no, like they're not going to fight for the U.S., there was 2 questions. They were put into the most severe internment camps, and other Japanese people also chastised them because you're making us look bad. Right? So it was a very difficult situation for them. But if you watch some of these documentaries, you hear the former internees talking about how these camps weren't that bad. It was like summer camp. I don't know why people are making a big deal. As they're saying this, there are tears streaming down their faces. It's like, I think this may be the first time that somebody asked them to think about that, to recall what that was like, and that there was such trauma, such silence around it that you see that trauma coming out, that they're really haunted by it. Well, all this history from Ozawa to Thind to Japanese internment, the perpetuation of the model minority myth, I think it illustrates this uncomfortable relationship that Asian Americans have with whiteness and citizenship, the forever foreigner status, even as they are dubbed model minorities. People have argued, including scholars, that Asian Americans are already white, or they're becoming white. And I think we should be careful about this argument. As Min Jo states, new stereotypes can emerge and unwhiten Asian Americans anytime, anywhere, no matter how successful and assimilated they have become. And I've argued in some of my published work on racial hierarchies that ultimately the real sacrifice is that which we make towards radical social change. As whiteness silences us, it also divides us from each other and from other people of color, right? It's like we're all fighting for the wages of whiteness, and we divide ourselves from each other. People of color, interracially and intraracially. And I often talk about whiteness as a club, right? There's no such thing as white people, like nobody looks like this. Even if you're albino, like people classified as albinos, they don't look like that. There's no such thing as white skin color. Whiteness is a political construction, a social and legal construction. It was made up, but it does have very real consequences. But as a club, I mean that it serves political purposes. As a club, if it serves the current political environment, certain people of color can be admitted into that club or kicked out, depending on what we need. Part of the political purpose of the model minority myth was to divide people of color. It was during the 60s. It was not an Asian American who came up with the model minority myth. It was a sociologist, I believe, one of my own. And the purpose was to divide people. And during the 60s, I'm sure you can guess which groups they were trying to divide. African Americans, the bad minorities, from Asian Americans, the good, quiet minorities. If you just keep your head down, the idea was, I don't know what you're complaining about, these black and brown people. If you just act like them, you wouldn't have any problems. They're minorities, they keep their head down, they're quiet, and they work hard, so you need to do that too. That was what was going on with the model minority myth. So that's part of why we call it a myth. It is an ideological construct that works to silence racism, and here it's silencing racism against Asian and African Americans. Now finally, I want to posit something kind of related, maybe not so much, it's something that I thought about when I was putting together this talk, and that is that whiteness seems to dictate not just who counts as an American, but what kind of hyphenated American we get to be, right? Like what kind of Asian Americans we get to be, Korean Americans in my case. And so I'll share a story to sort of hopefully illustrate. When I first started at Baruch, I met with this lady who was supposed to be part of my orientation. And as we're talking, she asked me, what's your ethnicity? And this isn't People have been asking me this my whole life. They asked me, I interviewed at 7 or 8 places at different universities. People asked me at dinner. They, most of the time, asked me as I was giving my job talk, right? In front of everyone. It's illegal. You're not supposed to be asking, but whatever. There are different reasons people ask, and I came up with different ways to deal with it. Sometimes it required a joke. Sometimes it required a direct answer. But she asked me very rudely and arrogantly, oh, so what's your ethnicity? And so I tell her, my mother is Korean, my father is white of German-Irish descent. Oh, well, is she Korean or Korean American? Right? Like, okay, so you, this white woman, the way that you're saying this, and the fact that I've dealt with people like this for such a long time, it's as if you are asserting, as this white person, you have the authority to decide my authenticity as a Korean or Korean American based on what you think. If my mother is born here, then she's not Korean, I guess, right? And what's that?
You're half a Korean, that is a part. That's a part white, part Asian.
Sorry for the interruption. Okay. So they're outsiders to my experience, right? But they're determining whether or not I'm an insider to my own experience, to my own ethnicity. And I see this a lot from people of color too, but from European Americans most of the time. On the last day of school, I'm walking my daughter Hope, who's 7, to school, and we were talking about her Korean dress, her hanbok, and her friend's mother wants to impress me by talking about how her daughter takes Taekwondo, and this is the way she talks. Oh, so your mother's from Korea? Well, my husband just came back from a trip from Korea. It's beautiful there. Have you ever been? So again, it's like this. It becomes a discussion about cultural traditions, and we didn't even call it a hanbok, but they want to impress me that they know that word hanbok. We called it a Korean dress. We are growing up in isolated rural town. My mother's just dealing with interpreting things for people, with communicating. So I didn't even learn the term hanbok until later. But Korean identity, Asian American identities, get consumed as food, like for Korean kimchi. Like, I love kimchi, chopsticks. And whether or not you speak the language, all very important. But to me, given what I dealt with in growing up, and my mother's had a very traumatic experience coming to the US, and in many ways is still very traumatic, it is dealing with that. It is being able to survive racism, being able to negotiating it, having a life of trying to deal with the racism I have been dealing with, and surviving it, the mistreatment, the emotion, the pain behind it. That's part of being Korean American as well. That makes me authentically Korean as well, having to deal with that experience, being called a chink every day when I'm growing up. And it was Margaret Cho who really helped me to understand why I really hated that term. I always sort of thought it, the comedian Margaret Cho, when I was younger, I heard her say in a sketch, you know what really bothers me is that if you're gonna be racist, get the racial slur right. Chinks are Chinese, gooks are Korean, and that's sort of like when they would call me a chink, like, I actually thought about, why are they calling me that? Isn't that what you call Chinese people? It's like the stupidity behind the stupidity of these racial slurs. But the mono-minority myth and consuming these identities as just culture and food and just reducing it to that is another way that racism gets silenced. And that's a big part of this discussion, whether we're looking at immigration or other issues affecting people of color today. We want to silence racism and call it something else. There's lots more that I could say about that. Lots of research on the mono-minority myth that Rosalind Chow has done, but I'm going to turn it over to Jamie Warren, who I know is also going to address some of these issues on silence. There's some common threads. Thank you.
Hi, guys. Do you like my title? I couldn't wait for that to come up. Ooh. And if you can't see the italicized part, that's supposed to be a joke, like a historical perspective, right? Like that's like the PBS version of it comes in, the NPR voice. Yeah, thank you, Angie. Can I say something before I do my talk? Can I say something? Where's she go? The people. I just want to say this, like, just even if it just throws us off for a second. But the People versus Hall. That I kept thinking about that law during your. Do you know this ruling? So can I just throw this out there for you? You can chew on this, and like this isn't even real where talks line up. But let me see if I get this right. People versus Hall, 1854, Supreme Court, like it's California State Supreme Court finds. Was it? I think it was California courts. Yeah, find that a Chinese immigrant man was murdered. Do you guys know this finding? His murderers were found guilty. There were 4 Chinese immigrant men who were witnesses to the murder. But they appeal on the idea that those people should not have been able to testify in court because, and here's where the logic comes up. I just want to put this in your pipe so you can smoke it later. But I kept thinking about this during Angie's talk. I think, stop me if I get this right or wrong. The judge, or if you read the finding, it was they couldn't testify in court because Native Americans couldn't testify in court. And when Columbus thought he had arrived in India, he was actually, and since he thought he was in India, we call those people Indians, and Indians are actually Asians, that means that Asians are American Indians and therefore can't testify in court. Truly, that's what happened, right? And therefore, Chinese immigrants could not testify in court, and it's just open heyday violence against Chinese immigrants. It's basically legal to murder a Chinese immigrant in the gold mines.
That guy was convicted at first, and then
It was overturned, yeah, they let him go because Columbus didn't know where he was hundreds of years ago. Welcome to America. Okay, so anyway, I just want to, let me give you, what I wanted to say too, I don't know, because I'm not sure if this was clear in that when you guys signed up, Angie and I are donating all of our portion of the door to a legal fund for families separated at the border. So you guys all just donated to an important charity tonight by coming out, so yay. And that, the news about the family separation had not even really made it into the mainstream conversation when we planned this talk, right? It was just I think it was the animals comment that Trump made that I was like, fuck, I got it, and did anyone watch recently, where was his last rally? He got the audience to chant animals. Did you guys see this? He goes, what are they? Animals. What are they? Animals. It's fucking happening, right? And it's been happening to various groups in this country for a long time. And it's just, so I was thinking about that and I was like, what do I have to say as a historian of the 19th century? Is there anything that I can bring to the table that would maybe be beneficial for historicizing this moment? So that's where I'm coming into this conversation. And I reached out to Angie and said, do you want to do something together? And we said, yes. Okay, so I want to start with a kind of a weird question. Because what I'm going to do tonight is just pretty much straight up historical narrative. I don't typically, when I do Olios, if you've ever been to any of my Olios, I tend to get kind of abstract and theoretical and talk about histories of ideas, but I'm just going to do history with history tonight. I'm going to just teach the history of the border, right? If we're putting up this wall and defending this border and calling people who try to cross the border not human, maybe we need to historicize how that border came into effect in the first place, right? But before I get there, I wanted to ask you guys, does anyone know when history started? I don't mean I mean when people like me were born, like historians who walk around in conferences and go to archives and teach history. What's that? Well, by this, and they would not necessarily call themselves historians. And by you might be what's that word where you study words, like philologist? Yeah, philology, folklore, all of these things have existed forever and all time. But a certain kind of thing where you're not a philosopher, you're not doing sociological research, you're not Marx, right? You're historian. Does anyone know when we started? Roughly the 19th century. What does that coincide with? Roughly the consolidation of nation states in the Western world, right? This is when nation states, and a nation is different than a nation state. You guys got that, right? Nations are just groups of people that identify through language and belief and custom. Nation states is when you lock that shit down to the gland. You're like, this is mine, and this is our language, nation state, right? And so when nation states start to consolidate, and by that I mean Europe is really starting to draw boundaries. People are starting to carry passports, right? There's a line in the sand that you can cross. That's the same time the professional discipline of history really starts to emerge in the academy. And we'd start to if I had gone to graduate school even 100 years ago, or just yesterday in Europe, I would have called myself a philosopher too, right? It's all very much an American thing to call it a social science. And so what do historians do? What do we study? And I don't mean the past. A lot of people study the past. Sociologists study the past. Anthropologists study the past. Biologists study the past. If I study dinosaurs, I'm studying the past. What do historians study? Nations. We are the origin myth makers. We're the Bible. We're the religion for countries. We're the reason that we tell you why we exist. Does that make sense? I'm here to tell you where you came from, America. That's my job, right? So why am I saying that? Well, I'm thinking kind of about the idea of this wall and this border and these people that are animals, what have you. And I've been thinking about, why would you need historians when you have nation states? So you had the question, what does it mean to be an American? One thing I like to ask my students is can anybody touch America? Go touch it. Can you touch it? Where is it? Is that and I know technically you could with your finger on the ground, this is America, but is that really America? What is it, right? It requires, so nation states even, I would argue, are fictions. They don't really exist. They're collections of ideas, right? That are sort of bordered through violence. Right? They just require massive violence to keep some sort of collective capital in the hands of the few. So you need these fictions, historians, the history tellers. What else do you need? You need memorials. You can go, I tell my students, we could go down to Washington, D.C. and touch statues. Is that America? If we touch Lincoln, did we touch America? And we also can do things like put up walls, right? And the wall, I would argue, is as permeable and as much a fiction or narrative driven is, I guess what I mean to say, as anything that I do as a historian. Even, let's say the wall does come into existence. The full-on wall is built on the border between the United States and Mexico. Does anyone really think it was being built to serve the purpose to keep people out? Absolutely not. Anybody that works in Border Patrol will tell you it's not going to do that job. It will be there to create a fiction of a nation state. And it'll be there it's like the ultimate gated white community, right? It's there as this artifice of whiteness. Okay, so I wanted to say more kind of what does it mean to be an American? Just thinking about your, even just what, and I promise, what does it mean to be an American? I can't help but think it's very much this thing that's happening a lot, even on the left right now. It's what does it mean to really be a good man? Right? Only men can be, only Americans can be, and I would think those two things are kind of synonymous, masculinity and Americanhood, right? Because you don't really ask in a woman, what does it mean to be a good woman? Women just are. There's no being a woman, right? You don't have quality. It's it's a very different, you know what I mean? The language is different here. Okay, so let's think about, let's go to the wall then. So my job tonight here for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to do basic college classroom history professor, what happened with the history of the border, right? Does anyone know this history very well? Yeah, okay, I know. We went to grad school together, that's my friend. I'm so excited to see her. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to start, we're going to kind of start in the middle, and then I'm going to go back. So I've got this random picture of part of the border or whatever. But I want to start with the first law passed in 1830, so in the antebellum period, right? So this is 30 years before the Civil War. The first law that tried to regulate and control the migration over the border. Oh, hey, how's it going? I just saw you. Between the United States and Mexico. So this law, I love teaching this law when I teach this to my students. This law was issued by the Mexican government against American citizens saying, stay the fuck out of our country. You keep breaking our laws. You're moving here. You're bringing slavery here. We just waged a revolution to end slavery. You will not comply with these basic tenets. We now officially ask you, no more migration to Mexico. That's the first law. Isn't that interesting? Don't you just want to chew on that for a while, right? So how did that happen, and how did we end up to where we are now? So I'm just going to do just a little bit of a brief history, an overview leading up to this law and what follows after it. Okay, so really what we're talking about then is the Mexican-American War, right? This is where this boundary comes from, and I I was trying to think of a way to do like a really quick like pop quiz with everybody, not to make people feel uneducated or like they don't know things, but just to kind of demonstrate to us, if you're like most people that live in this country, we probably have very little working knowledge of the Mexican-American War. Does that feel true to you? Do you feel like you could kind of put everything you know about the Mexican-American War in a thimble? But you could fill like a cup or a bowl about Vietnam or World War II. Of these other American wars, like Civil War, yeah, I could fill a full cup of knowledge, thimble, with the Mexican-American War, right? Anyone even know the years? Yeah. Does anyone know, and I'm not picking, this drives the point home. Does anyone even know the years the war was fought? It is the 1840s, yeah, 46 to 48. In case I forget to mention it later, they lose the war right before gold was discovered in California. Can you imagine? Like, okay, so yeah, 1846 to 1848. So can anyone name when was Vietnam? When was the Vietnam War? Actually, I don't even know. Sometime, yeah. World War II, right? World War I. You probably have these other working dates. Mexican-American War? Yeah. So isn't that interesting? Why do we know so little about this war? And one thing, I kind of want to talk about this at the end of my talk. Why do we know so little? And I don't think the answer is as simple as we don't like to address wrongdoings in the American past. Even if we address them incorrectly, we tend to try to romanticize our wrongdoings, right? We make, like 1 year ago, there was like 4 movies about slavery. We were like fetishizing black pain, just like going to the movies and watching movies about black pain, right? Yeah.
My social studies teacher this year, I was telling her about, I was emailing her this documentary for her to watch, and I told her how we stopped Columbus and the Native Americans, and she sort of romanticized, she made an excuse for the wrongdoings of Columbus. She said, well, enslavement and genocide was a practice of that time.
Yeah, and it was like, it drove us, that's a very important point, like it drives us toward the future, right? Even people who don't tend to say something so simplistic that it was like of that time, there's still this belief implicit in a lot of our discussions about these wrongdoings that they at least drove his civilization forward, right? So yeah, so I want to suggest that I don't think that it's simply that we're unwilling to look at what we did wrong as a country, even if we do it incorrectly, right? We have never had an honest reckoning with slavery, but most people know about it. We've never had a really honest reckoning with the Vietnam War. As a point of comparison though, today, before I came in, I tried to go on Wikipedia. I'd like to have like all the different film sites, because like, how do most people learn history? Movies, right? From what I could count, just since like 1980, there have been 75 American-made films about the Vietnam War. I couldn't even count, because I was literally had to like go like this and like had to count like American versus non-American made. I couldn't count. I lost count after like 100 about World War II, and that's maybe because like we were the good guys or whatever. Okay, guess how many wars or how many movies have been made about the Mexican-American War? 1. And it's called One Man's Hero. It's made in 1999. However, there have been, because I think that if I was like, when I ask people, do you know anything about the Mexican-American War? They're like, ooh, and I'm like, Davy Crockett? Like, oh yeah, totally, Davy Crockett. Right? The Alamo? Oh, yep, got that. Right? And it's like, do you know that is that, right? They're like, what? Right? They're very connected events. So there's only one movie made about the Mexican-American War proper, but there were, to my count, 12 about the Alamo. So let me, before I go into like what happened at the Alamo, has anyone been to the Alamo, the site? Oh my gosh, you have? I couldn't find out the answer to this. Is it true that the United Nations is going to make it like a global landmark on keeping with like the pyramids and stuff? Like you can't, like, what? It has that stat. Lord have mercy. Are you kidding me? Okay, so this is a bunch of like people that just like invaded another nation because they wanted to spread slavery there. That's what happened. Like it was a bunch of white people trying to spread slavery into a land that was not their own. But we should never forget the Alamo, because a few of them got murdered by that nation's military. So I just want to share, there's 12 movies America made about the Alamo. Here's some of them. The Immortal Alamo, Martyrs of the Alamo, Davy Crockett at the Fall of the Alamo, Heroes of the Alamo, Alamo, Shrine of Texas Liberty, The Man from the Alamo, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, The Last Command, The Alamo. They just keep 13 Days to Glory, Texas, The Alamo, The Price of Freedom, Two for Texas, The Alamo, Battle of San Jacinto, Texas Rising, The Alamo, a bunch of dirty ass slaveholders. No, I'm just kidding, I made that up. It's not true. So you get my point here. Our historical memory of this is only framed, the only thing we seem to know about the Mexican-American War is Pee Wee Herman's comical, there's no basement, that's the limit of most Americans' knowledge. And I teach at BMCC. A lot of my students, are Spanish-speaking students of Latin American descent, and Mexican-American students for their family. And they're like, we don't even know about this. If you grew up in Mexico, though, you would know a lot about the Mexican-American War, and the public memorials to this war would be very different than the ones we encounter here. Our last point tonight, I'm looking at, there is a memorial to the Mexican-American War in New York City. Does anyone know where it is? Worth Park and Worth Street. This is General Worth. We're gonna talk a little about General Worth. Okay, so my goal and then let me see what time it is here. What I'd like to do then in the next 10, 15 minutes, I want to help change this, right? I think what's important for us as citizens of the world, watching what's happening. I think most of us have beating hearts, and so we're turning on the news and we're just horrified every day, I would assume. And if you're not, I hope that I make you really uncomfortable tonight. If you're a Trump supporter, I hope I make you hate me. But I'm assuming you're not. So I think part of what we can do maybe I'm just romanticizing education too much, is to learn about the history of this border and how it came into existence. So anyone want to give a one-word answer? What do you think caused the Mexican-American War, the central cause of it? Slavery, right? When in doubt, if it's the 19th century US, the answer is probably slavery until after the Civil War. The answer is probably capitalism, right? Okay, so let's talk about how this war comes into existence. So this is just American History 101 stuff here. Let me get my notes. Okay, so to understand the Mexican-American War, we have to start, and I'm just gonna go through this quickly, so just hold on your seats. I'm going to talk real fast. We're just going to go. We have to understand it begins with the Mexican War for Independence. Mexico had just waged a 10-year-long battle against a European empire, much like the United States did against the British Empire, even though it was actually different, because in the United States, it was actual British people fighting against the British Empire. That's another story. But you get my point, right? This is a war to throw off European stronghold of a colonized people. According to the United States sort of doctrine at this time, how should they feel about the Mexican Revolution against the Spanish Empire? They should be in support of it. It's part of the statement in the Declaration of Independence is that you're supposed to support other nation states that take on this charge, right? We should have supported the Mexican Revolution. It's in keeping with everything if there's anything good about some of the initial statements of the early American doctrine, it was that it was anti-imperialist. Okay, and so 11 years long battle. Think about the United States, the American Revolution was 5 years, more or less. Am I right? I think. Okay, so this is a very war-weary country at this point. They are stripped. They are very sort of materially and militarily and economically depleted from this war. So the Spanish, one of the things they're trying to do to hold on to Mexico is what will become Mexico, is they try to hold Texas, because they see this as a place that's kind of, it's a borderland, right? And so what they do is they offer a land grant to white Americans that will promise to be loyal to the Spanish crown. And so they give huge amounts of land to a guy named Moses Austin, who dies in the process of this. He has a son, Stephen Austin. So the Austins moved to Texas, and they were like, okay, we will be the right kind of Spanish, we will be the right kind of white settler that promises to be loyal to the Spanish crown. Can we bring slaves? They're like, sure. whatever. Just don't join the Mexican Revolution. No problem. Okay, so you've got there, and so at this point, thousands of white Americans they're actually called filibusters, are moving into Texas, the Texas region, which is it's Spain, it's Mexico, it's hard to describe it as a geographical place at this point, but I'm just going to call it what we now call Texas. Does that make sense? But it's not Texas yet. Okay, so one thing you need to understand too, the Mexican Revolution, it was fought for Mexican independence, but it was also fought for some ideological beliefs, like all revolutions tend to, they put forth a sort of a truth. And one of the major motivations behind the Mexican Revolution was to get rid of slavery. It was illegal under the Mexican Constitution to own another human being, right? So let me just pause here for a second and explain why this is the conflict around slavery and folks that are moving into Texas from the American setting and bringing slavery with them. So, because you can imagine, right? The Americans are like, sweet. Mexico is in this long, 10 years long battle. They're war weary. We're going to get Mexico. We're going to invade as soon as this war is over. It'd be like if the French did this to the Americans right after the American Revolution. We'd all be speaking French, right? It's a very weak time to go after a nation. But the debate, so it's interesting, I'm very interested in slaveholders and how they thought about their role in history. And a lot of slaveholders, especially the plantation owners, the super elites, were like, we can take Mexico. Once we got Mexico, it's the whole hemisphere, babe. We can take all of it. It's all going to be a slaveholders' republic, the entire hemisphere. Other slaveholders said, no, that's too dangerous. Anyone want to guess why? You don't want a slaveholders' republic with that many brown people. So that's how the slaveholders were divided over this. Northern abolitionists and just northern free soilers are like, we do not want anything to do with Texas or the Mexican Revolution, because remember, this is before the Civil War, and so there's this whole balance of free and slave states that's leading us towards a civil war. And it's like, if we get any more slave territory, the slaveholders are going to have more power in Congress. Right, and that's going to go against the interests of northern industrialists and abolitionists too. So it's an anti-slavery sentiment. It's also a pro-industrialization sentiment. But you see, this is always slavery is at the very center of the story. Okay, and so at this point, white Americans are continuing to flock into what we call the Texas region, and they're bringing black enslaved people with them. I should say too, there's another migration of black people to the Texas region who have either fled slavery, who have escaped slavery. If you're in the Deep South, the first place you would go is to Mexico, right? If they're waging a war to end slavery, go to Mexico. Screw Canada, it's way too far away, right? So there's a decent population of free blacks in the Texas region, and so people that had escaped slavery, or if you were a free black person, and your choice is should I just chill in Alabama? Or go to Mexico, right? Do you see that? I would go to Mexico. So that's the kind of setting here, and I'm simplifying a lot for the sake of time. So this is when you see this 1830 colonization laws passed, because at 1821 the Mexican Revolution is successful. You now have a Mexican nation state, right? Okay, so the Mexican government passes this law, and they said, stop bringing slaves here. And then right after that, they said, you just can't come unless you're going, a very few number of white Americans are going to be able to come at all, because you guys are bringing the institution of slavery with you. And this is destabilizing our economy, and it's destabilizing the revolution. And slavery brings with it a whole host of ideological and political institutions that were destabilizing what the new Mexican revolutionary government was trying to establish. Okay, so at this point then, this is when you get the Alamo, the Texas Revolt. This is when the Texians revolt against this oppression. Right? Remember the Alamo, guys, because, God, they almost lost slavery. Right? Crimea River. So this is when the battle breaks out over Texas. And I hate military history. I won't bore you with it. Just know that Santa Anna's military, even though they killed people at the Alamo, they lost. They lost Texas. So for a while, I don't think everyone knows this. Did you guys know Texas was a country? Right? When people are like, Texas will rise again, it's like, it was a country. It's weird. So the Republic of Texas is declared in 1837. Eventually, Sam Houston becomes president. And the Mexican government's very clear, we are coming back for you. This is not settled, right? Because what do you think Texas wants to do right away? They want to join the United States of America. And so the Mexican government saying to the US government, do not recognize the statehood of Texas. They are not a nation. If you do, we see that as an act of war. And don't you dare annex them into your country, because that's still our territory. We're just going to catch our breath. We're coming back for Texas. Got it? Texas is like, okay, in the meantime, while the United States figures out whether or not they're going to bring us into the fold, we've got to write a constitution, we've got an elected president, we've got to get a currency, we have to have a system of government. So they write a constitution, and some key points: they legalize slavery and they ban all free black people. So remember the Alamo. Okay, so I just want to show you here, this is Mexico, 1821, right? So and so obviously the United States doesn't just have its eye on, I didn't make this clear, but like, why would slaveholders be so desperate for that region in particular? Cotton grows really well in Texas soil, and this is the beginning of the cotton boom. And also, people wanted California desperately for the trade. So this is always being driven by this desire for expansion of slavery, and the Missouri Compromise had already made it illegal, even though they overturned this later, but to take slavery north, farther north, in what would be the Louisiana Purchase, like here. So this is the slaveholders' chance to expand the slavery empire, right? And they see that they use this as their opportunity. I know, shoot, okay. So I want to pause here for a second. So it's 1837, right? Texas is a country. You've got this country, like, bring them in, bring Texas in as a state. Other slaveholders saying, no, don't. They're just like, can you just imagine them just like laying in bed, like they're like their wettest dreams, like, what can we do with Texas? They're like divided up into like 5 states. We'll get 5 new states, which would be, 10 new senators. They'll all be plantation owners. Like, we will rule forever. And then we'll get Cuba and the Caribbean, and we'll probably go back and just take England too, just for fun. Like, it's just like, this was their key to power, right? Meanwhile, you've got a very smart, radical abolitionist press that is that's very aware of this and is pushing back stronghold. This is about slavery. And also, one thing to remember, I like to point this out to my students, whenever we teach these atrocities in the past, I think it's really important to stop and remind ourselves, like, do you think everybody was into it? Do you think all, like, white Americans are like, yeah, I don't care, fuck it, get it? I mean, do you want to be judged by the content of what's happening in our government in 200 years? Does it reflect your character? Right? So there was resistance around this. There were many Americans like, this feels kind of wrong, right? We invaded that region during a time of like profound national fragility, and it was a war fought for independence, which I thought we were all about, right? Even if I'm not an abolitionist, I don't like being an invading nation against an unoffending people, right? So this ideology emerges, manifest destiny. And what you need to understand about manifest destiny, I'm going to show you a couple of quotes before we actually get to the actual statement on manifest destiny. So this is a painting we often use to depict manifest destiny, right? But I want to show you a couple of like actual journalistic quotes. And this is someone defending, trying to try to conquer and claim the West under American sovereignty. And they wrote, acquisitions of territory, I love this quote, it's so interesting. Acquisitions of territory in America, even if accomplished by force or arms, are not to be viewed in the same light as the invasions and conquests of the old world. Meaning we're not British just because we're acting like it. We're not the same as the thing that we just claimed we overthrew, even though we're using military invasion, even though we're becoming an empire, and we just promised we never would, because our way lies over trampled nations, our way lies not over trampled nations, but through, sorry, there's a typo here, but through desert wastes. Do you see like I mean, obviously it's wrong, but like, if there was nobody there, why was it military arms? Like, did you just go shoot tumbleweed? He's like saying like, there was no one there. So we conquered a desert wasteland. We're going to go civilize it because there was nobody there. Okay, so who was there? We know, like, even if you haven't studied American history, take a guess. Who was there? Many Native American nations, first of all. Many, I guess, at this point we would call them Mexicans. People of various, Spanish, Mexican, indigenous people descent. A lot of rancheros, a lot of Mexican ranches. So this is a very populated territory. that the United States is seeking to acquire in Texas, and eventually they have their eyes set on the prize. And so this is, John Sullivan is the first person that we know that said this actually in print. Our manifest destiny is to spread over the continent. And what this means is, he said, what's important about this, when he says manifest destiny, if you're not clear about the term, it means God's intention. Manifest destiny means God meant for when when Jamestown happened, when Puritans arrived on the East Coast, the original goal had always been geographic, to exist from coast to coast. And I just kind of you gotta love this kind of thinking that imagines God with a map and a plan. Do you know what I mean? Like a geographically minded God, right? That's thinking about coastlines and longitudes and latitudes, right? So this is the idea is it's our duty, right? Do you see the woman there? It's her duty. What's going to happen to all this wasteland if we don't bring our whiteness to it? And she's she is this white. Do you know what I mean? You can see through her. She's so white. And so I think it's important to note that these journalists were writing at the imperative of political lobbyists and political pressure to, and I say this I could demonstrate it to you with different kinds of notes and archival research, but just believe me, it was a self-conscious effort to distance the expansionist empire from the slavery debate. People, even if you were just kind of a middle, moderate, kind of ho-hum person, most Americans would have been uncomfortable with the idea that we're going to wage war against an unoffending nation to spread an already very politically debated institution of enslavement there. Oh, right? Even still, we're well, we're bringing them democracy. Do you see, we still have to create these ideological facades to wage wars for empire. So the Manifest Destiny was a facade, and it was self-conscious. We need something to cover up slavery, God. And what I think, and I wish I could spend the next hour talking about this, but I can't. It's God, it's race, right? This is where I think it's very interesting. It's a woman, right? She's very lily white. And this other, you can't see this as manifest domesticity. This was not necessarily a word that they used, but let me read you this. A lot of white women, white women have always been part and parcel of spreading white supremacy. And a lot of white women, they kind of took the stage too, and they said, we have a duty to that desert wasteland, right? So Mary Austin, so she's one of the, she's a wife of one of the Austins. I just want to read a little bit of what she says here. She's trying to explain, we women have something to do for these poor people living in Mexico, right? This is her writing. The Mexicans are commonly very indolent, of loose morals, and if not infidels, of which they are many, involved in the grossest of superstitions. This view exhibits why it is by no means wonderful that this people have been the dupes and slaves of so many masters, or that the plans of intelligent and patriotic men for the political regeneration of Mexico have heretofore entirely failed. The moral education of this people must be improved before their political condition can be ameliorated. So this white savior complex, and it's coming from, and so what they started to say is what we need to do is we need to go to Mexico, and they start talking about not necessarily bringing slavery there. They said, we're going to bring, what do you think white women said they were going to bring? Not religion, the nuclear family. We're going to show them not to live communally, not to live intergenerationally. Don't have moms and aunts and grandmas living in the same house. No, just mom, dad, and 4 kids. That's it. And they start really, before 1950s, the nuclear family becomes this model of colonization. And this is how white women played a part in this. So I know that I got to stop. Oh, shoot. Okay, hold on. So I'm just going to go blah, blah, blah. Mexican war happens. Just know this, that the United States invaded Mexico. They annexed Texas, first of all. They annexed Texas. They said, yes, we'll take Texas. It's a state. And Mexico's we said no, right? No, sorry, at least they didn't carve it up to several states, but they took Texas, and then they started debating where Texas stopped and Mexico began, and there was a 1 mile strip or something like that, and everyone was no, it's here, it's there, whatever. And so Polk stationed the U.S. military on the other side of that line, and they're just standing there right? We're in your country, what are you gonna do? Until finally, the Mexican military responds. But they fired first, so technically the Mexicans fired first. But we invaded their nation. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, so the Treaty of Guadalupe is passed. Mexico loses a third of their land. A third of their country is lost, right? Very fertile soil. They lose the whole coast of California, which is really important for international trade. The Treaty of Guadalupe was supposed to promise that all of the people who basically went to bed in Mexico and woke up in the United States, right? They didn't cross any border. A border crossed them in their living life, right? That their citizenship was supposed to be respected. But what happened, and they could have dual citizenship, but what actually ended up happening is a lot of these were ranching families, and within a couple of generations, you can see it happened very quickly. Like a banking agent would show up and say, actually, do you know that you need to pay taxes on this land? It goes back really far. I'm sorry, I only have documents in English, and you're gonna have to show up at the court, and I hope you have some transportation to get there, because it's like 300 miles away, and by the time you get there, like, oh yeah, actually, we don't own that land anymore, but you can work for this corporate farming agency as a wage worker. And this happens systematically until all these families, I shouldn't say all, but many of these families lose their land, become impoverished and this is land that have been held in family ownership forever, right? And is now owned by American corporation in the 19th century. So that's the history of the border. Do you feel like you know more now than you did 20 minutes ago? But I want to wrap up by just looking at, because I'm going to skip this because I'm out of time. I actually couldn't find very many pictures of Mexican American memorials in this country because there just aren't very many. So I thought I would just focus on one. And this is, so General Worth, Major Worth, I should say, he was one of the major heroes of the Mexican-American War. He was one of the major generals. And I just got to bring this up too. So he survived the war. He was a huge hero. This is the second oldest memorial in New York City. This is on 25th and Broadway. There's like Worth Park, Worth Street, and Tribeca is named after him. And I learned this about him today. I didn't know this. After the war, he died a few years after the war. I think maybe even like a year after, of cholera, which just basically means, I was going to say it because like he just shit himself to death. Ha ha. But that's what cholera is. It sucks. But right before that, he had accepted a contract from slaveholders in Cuba to wage a private war in the interest of slaveholders to create like a new slaveholders republic. It didn't happen because he died. But he was offered $3 million from this group of Havana plantation owners. He's like, yeah, sure, why not? No loyalty to anything, but yeah, sure, why not? Okay, so let me wrap up by reading to you from Frederick Douglass, right? Because let's go out with something with a good one. So Frederick Douglass, what is the year? The year will be on the slide that I post. You guys know who Frederick Douglass was, right? He was a abolitionist. He escaped slavery. He was one of the most important writers of the 19th century. He was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. He was a women's rights activist. Just all around cool guy. And he was asked to give, after the war was over, he was he was one of the many outspoken critics of the Mexican-American War. Probably the most famous one is Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience. That's when he goes to prison because he's like, I'm not paying taxes to a government that would do this, right? That's Thoreau. What's that? Yeah, exactly, right. But still, on civil disobedience is amazing, right? As a piece of writing. So Douglass is one of these critics, and so General Worth dies of cholera, and he's actually speaking in Boston at an abolitionist meeting, and you can tell his disdain from when you would go to some of these Boston meetings. I just picture him speaking to like a lot of nice white ladies eating cucumber sandwiches, right? And like a few nice, guys that are like, oh, look at us, we're such good people. Like we would attend a Frederick Douglass lecture, even though we're just hanging out in Boston and not really doing anything to end slavery. Whatever. So you can just feel his anger, right? When he's speaking at these conventions, and they said, would you like to say something about Worth? And before I say that, I just want to say, when we say remember the Alamo, or never forget 9/11, all this stuff, it's important for us to, I think, to really think about what does it mean to remember the dead and to use the dead for any sort of purpose politically, right? Because what happens, the Civil War, the Mexican-American War, it doesn't matter why you've died or why you fought. It only matters that you died. And therefore, the cause of the war falls from view. And I think that the way we use the dead is very problematic. The dead cannot be a political tool. But Douglass is asked to because during the war, he had been like, I hate General Worth. He's a stinky guy, yucko. And when he dies, do you want to, now that you have the microphone at Our Ladies Convention or whatever, would you like to say something about the former deceased hero, General Worth? And this is what he said. I think I've got a slide here. You can read along with me. Someone has asked me to say a word about General Worth. I only know General Worth by his acts in Mexico and elsewhere in the service of the slaveholding and slave trading government. I know why the question is put. It is because one of your city papers, which does not rise to the dignity of being called a paper, a sheet of the basest sort, has said that my tongue ought to be cut out of its roots because upon hearing of the death of the man, I made use of the remark, it is not yet stated in what connection I made it or where, that another legalized murderer had gone to his account. I say so yet. I will not undertake to defend what I said then or to shop up his character or history. You know, as well as I do, that Faneuil Hall has resounded with the echoing applause of the denunciation of the Mexican-American War as a murderous war, as a war against the free states, as a war against freedom, against the Negro, and against the interests of working men in this country, and as a means of extending that great evil and damning curse Negro slavery. Why may not the oppressed say, when the oppressor is dead, either by disease or by the hand of the foeman on the battlefield, that there is one less of his oppressors left on earth? And this part just gets it. For my part, I would not care if tomorrow I should hear of the death of every man who engaged in that bloody war in Mexico, and that every man had met the fate he went there to perpetuate against unoffending Mexicans. Like, he would not have worn, like, I support our troops. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Project Douglas.
You were talking about the legal status of the various people you mentioned in the beginning. What was the various people you spoke of who were trying to become citizens? Yeah, what was their legal status then if they were not citizens?
So there were a number of cases in 1799. So, sorry. What? Take it out. Okay. They weren't citizens. There were a number of people who, in order to become citizens, you had to apply. There was this new rule in 1790, so you have a number of people going to the courts because the idea is that if you're going to apply to be a U.S. citizen, you have to prove that you're white. So neither of them were. They were kind of test cases, and there was a couple of, I can't remember the exact name, the Pacific Coast something or other organization that would help fund these legal cases. A lot of people, I mean, there are a number of others who they applied for citizenship, and it was out of the courts. It was just, they applied and they got citizenship. But this was sort of the arbitrariness of it. I mean, you could just go through just a chart of some of the people and their background and the ruling, and it was back and forth. There are cases where at one point Armenians are defined as white and another point they're not. So the courts were really just making this up as they went along. They wanted to define whiteness as tied to citizenship, and they didn't really have a good explanation.
So were they considered to be legal residents, or
they were
some limbo?
They were not. Yeah, they were just not. I mean, Azawa, I think we know less about what happened to him after than we do Thin. Thin stayed in the country.
Okay.
And just continued to.
But they weren't.
lecture
Most
until-
these people were not necessarily deported.
Not thinned. Some were. I mean, there
Okay.
was. And I think with thinned, I'm not sure how I think he moved around a lot because they were really after him. I'm not sure I mentioned why they kept appealing his case. The theory is that because he was involved in the Goddard Party against British imperialism for Indian independence, and that this agent at the Bureau really was going after him, and that the government had been following him. And actually one of the judges did make mention of some of his activism. So I think that's why they really went after Thin, but then the ruling for him affected everyone. So there were other Asian Indians who had applied and were looking for naturalization. Everybody was watching this case.
Okay. Just as a side note, I know public education depends very much on where you are and what time you learn, but we actually read Felber de Manzanar when I was in 8th grade in middle school, which is kind of unusual, I suppose.
So you're saying that some of the things that I was presenting about schools didn't really.
I was very surprised. I'm sure the teacher just chose it and. No, for Felber de Manzanar it's an autobiography of somebody who actually was at one of the camps, called Manzanar.
I will say, the thing that the curriculum stuff that you're describing, it's pretty recent, right? Like it's been there's been like in the last 20 years, it's been getting really bad. It's like the Texas I keep going after Texas, but like the textbook war, right? So like history curriculum is being written by Texas School Board of Education. It matters to everybody because if you want your book published, it has to appeal to the Texas School Board because they buy the most books. And so Texas is determining what history we all learn. And it's about 20 years ago. And they took, there was a move to, and like no historians were on the board of making any decisions. And they took out Thomas Jefferson, who cares about Thomas Jefferson? But it's just because of like separation of church and state. There was a move to start the American Survey in 1877. And so, right? So like some of this more conservative curriculum changes are happening only in like the last 20 years, and it's getting worse. Yeah.
So I'm dating myself then. Okay.
Growing up like in the 1980s, it certainly was. I mean, but Justice has shared with you her experience in a progressive town. Some of the things that she, and also there's more of a push towards, No Child Left Behind has something to do with this too, and the push for instruction time and everything being monitored, that there's a tie with that.
I just wanted to sort of speak or ask a question about your statement regarding the quotes that you started with and like elementary school age children's version of what it is to be an American. And I think about the American public education system, and when child labor laws came into effect, and it was about ushering all these children into public school systems and really socializing them, it's stripping all of the identity, right? Like that is where we learn to be Americans, and we say the pledge, and we take that home, and you have people like your mom, I think you said, who didn't transfer languages, or perhaps your grandparents or something who didn't transfer languages to their younger generations that were first or second generation here. So, and now today we have all of these people that are like, multilingual families are amazing and we should be embracing all of that. And so I think that it's important to remember when there was this standardization, and even bringing up the No Child Left Behind, like that makes a lot of sense. That was Bush era, Bush's Texas, like that it would make sense that all those things correlate together, and that the push is really coming from a people with private interests in having a big say over what it is to be an American, and why today you hear little kids being so vehemently like, this is America, and it's about God, and it's about red, white, and blue. And it's interesting to me, like when you said that, it just popped into my mind that it really is about or at the time it was, throughout the 20th century, it was about the socialization of children and really getting people to embrace capitalism and the suburban lifestyle and the nuclear family, or the resurgence of the nuclear family, and putting women back in the home after they had just sacrificed and gone out and worked jobs during the Second World War and all this stuff. So it's just interesting how we have these major shifts, and it's all ideologies.
And I think you make a good point about that. That's like two things can be happening at the same time. You have that, and in addition you have, but we're multicultural, and let's have multicultural day. And again, and they did this also in my daughter's school, and I know lots of schools that do it, and they have like the food in it. It's the food and everything else, and it's you get a month for Women's History and a month for Black History Month, and you get this tolerance curriculum, which is problematic as it is, and that's kind of outdated. Like, haven't we already critiqued the word tolerance? Shouldn't it be more than that? But you've got that conservative, very conformist kind of curriculum that's tied into the textbook market. I always recommend Lies My Teacher Told Me, and I think that James Lowen is also respectful of the fact that this isn't just teachers. A lot of times teachers are required to do this, and it's pushed on them. At the same time, you've got this multicultural curriculum that doesn't center racism. Like, little kids can handle it. You can talk to them about racism. You can talk to them about Columbus. I've given Justice's principal a number of ways that you can handle Columbus. Like, you could just not teach it. Since you're so concerned about instruction time, I guarantee you this is not on any standardized test. You're so concerned about it, there's not going to be a question about them. So one, you could just not teach it. There's lots of blue ribbon schools that have put Columbus on mock trial. Or, you know what I'd like you to do? I'd like you to give them objects and say that this is, you know what, we used to think that Columbus discovered America, the United States, but now historians know that this is not true, and here are different objects that they use, and they actually rank what's more. There's poems like, can you look at these, get into groups, which is the more, probably the more important evidence, which is stronger evidence, and they're very hands-on learning. So it's like we can give concrete examples as to how to do it better. But I think a lot for the reasons that we've raised, that there's so many schools that just aren't opening to hearing that, or administrations, I should say.
No.
Just one more question?
There's someone behind you.
Oh.
Hi there, sorry. So I grew up in Texas, actually, and I remember my 6th grade historian or social studies teacher talking about the Civil War and asking what was it about, and I said, oh, it's about slavery, and her going, no, it's about states' rights. And I was like, no, it's about slavery. So I can relate to the fact that history is being oppressed or whatever. My question is, how do you guys feel about the movement to take down monuments honoring Civil War heroes and stuff like that? Do you think that is, you hear a lot of different arguments about how we should keep them up so that we remember the travesties they've done?
Yeah.
Or do you have an opinion either way on that?
I do. I mean, I don't think I'm the only historian to say this. There was some, I think it was a Chronicle of Education, there was like this kind of joke that was like, another historian's doing her work, going to statues, looking at statues, that's what we do. Like, that is not history. That's not history, that's not where we learn anything. They're statues. Like, the plaques are written by some like nice white ladies association that's like 4 words. Like, there's literally nothing you can learn from a statue except who has power in that society. And so taking down, if it's a public memorial, if it's a public memorial to somebody that represents the Confederacy, I think that that continued presence is a continued presence of white supremacy that acts as a threat in public space. It is there to intimidate a different kind of public consciousness. I mean, I could kind of go on about this for a long time, but yeah, it's not about undoing history, right? This is about actually creating a more open public space. So I don't want to talk too long on this. Did you want to say something on it?
I'd like to plug my article. I wrote on something was, I mean, you could Google it on liberal ideology and the case of Charlottesville in a conversation with Justice, because she's the one who, we were actually on a bike ride and I was trying to enjoy life, and she had asked me what a white supremacist, like how to define it, and then I had to get into this whole big thing, and I got all angry because I was trying to relax, but then I wrote this thing. So you can Google that. But then there's another one so that one's just sort of like a commentary, liberal ideology in the case of Charlottesville. But then there's one called Royal Must Fall. If you can't get it, just email me and I'll send it to you. But it's on Isaac Royal, who was a slave holder in New England. So it's called Royal Must Fall, Old and New Battles on Public Memory in New England. That people don't know that there was this plantation, that there were slave. It wasn't just that the North had this indirect relationship to slavery. There's this guy, and then it was tied into Harvard's taking away the Royal Crest Shield. There's a group called Royal Must Fall, and they had a protest. And after their protest, they came back to, there's a wall of tenured professors at Harvard, and there was black tape, slashes over only the African American tenured professors, and so it became this movement. But one of the people on the committee argues not to get rid of the shield for that reason, because you're whitewashing history if you get rid of it. And my response to that is that you can put up pictures of African Americans and how they built this Ivy League college and built a lot of northern schools, Ivy League schools, Brown, and schools like Rutgers, and you would still be telling a history.
Yeah.
Why do you need to keep the shield?
I'm just saying, yeah, like,
This is your area.
No, I'm not trying to interrupt, but I wanted to say, like, that point, what I want to add too is, like, I do believe even though I said statues aren't history, I do believe what we collectively memorialize does reflect a value system, and that it does create an engagement with the past that's meaningful. But one of the things I think is very problematic, particularly about Confederate memorials, is they're never, show him drunk whipping a slave. Make that the statue. You know what I'm saying? Like, make it a statue to enslavement. If you want to hold on to the past, one thing I think is interesting to compare American memorialization of slavery to Germany's memorials. I was talking about this in my last Olio. Germany's public memorials around the Holocaust. It's very different, right? So if you're going to memorialize slavery in this country, you usually put up a statue of a naked black body. Interesting, right? Slaves typically wore clothes, right? So what you're seeing there is like when we do memorialize slavery, we make it only a black issue, right? And so we don't memorialize slavery by looking at slavery as an institution. If you look at, if you go to Germany and you look at the memorials to the Holocaust, you don't tend to see naked statues of Jewish victims. What you see are memorials that somehow capture the institution of the Holocaust, the trains, the offices, the camps. So what you see in the public space when you confront the memorial is Nazism. You don't see just the death of Jewishness as almost like a fetishization of this pain. Does that make sense? And so I don't think that there is a place for public memorial, but I think in America, when it comes particularly to slavery, we memorialize freedom, we valorize these guys, but it's just, it was just that time. They knew what they were doing. They were very clear with what they were doing. Many of them knew it was wrong, right? And none of them said the war was about states' rights. Not one of those fuckers said they knew it was about slavery. So, yeah. Are we done? Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to go there. No,